Originally, when I started scripting this video, my vision was to make something broad and informative about importing watches in general. After a while though, I realised it had become extremely unwieldy and hard to follow, so I scrapped the idea, and instead I've decided to narrow into the Japanese domestic market specifically. This video is going to look at exactly why there are so many JDM models to begin with, how much importing costs into other regions, discussing companies that will handle the process for you, and finally simply discussing some JDM models that I would personally recommend. I'll just add that I've utilised a fair bit of B-roll of JDM pieces that I've imported into my own collection at times, rather than bombarding the screen with import tax information constantly, as that made the video look like a presentation in an office and it's not meant to have that vibe. Anyway, if all that sounds good to you, let's get into the video. To begin with, I want to discuss why there are Japanese domestic market models to begin with. Japan has the third largest watch industry in the world, behind only Switzerland and China. And beyond the reasons I'm about to list, why wouldn't companies from a proud nation want to make watches for their own people? Focusing on a customer base this directly also helps those companies to build brand loyalty. The lack of need for a global distribution network to support the sale of the models also means that they can be offered at more competitive prices. That obvious point aside, there are a number of other reasons why these watches are produced, and reasons why they don't see wider global releases. One of those reasons that requires localization worldwide is language. Models that have date, day or month complications are often made language specific, so JDM models will often feature kanji for these complications and of course for the indices. Another reason is simply regional preferences. Japanese culture is more conservative than the West, and so customers prefer understated elegance, smaller pieces and more minimalistic design language. Finishing is another big part of this. JDM models in the past were generally finished to a higher standard, though I think that this is something that's changed over time, particularly with the popularity of Zaratsu polishing and other finishing techniques from brands like Grand Seiko. It is also true that occasionally the Japanese domestic market is used as a testing ground for pieces ahead of a wider release. One major difference I would flag up from my own personal experience is that the straps and bracelets tend to be sized slightly smaller, and a final reason that's more niche as it only applies to specific movements is that some watches featuring radio sync functionality are only set up to work with Japanese atomic clocks. So there is a pretty comprehensive list of reasons why these pieces exist. It can just be frustrating as an international fan, as import tax and availability aside, often a big issue is simply not being aware that these models exist. Now, I wanted to feature a small section here discussing what the fees are for importing JDM watches into some of the bigger territories, the US, EU and UK in particular. However, this quickly became problematic because it isn't as simple as you might think. There is no completely flat percentage rate to quote. Instead, there are ranges and different places do things differently. Some charge VAT, some handling fees, some processing fees, some import duty and some brokerage fees. Not only that, but the fees themselves are variable within a range depending on the value of the watch and the materials it's made from. Given the current shifting and volatile economic climate, any figures that I did quote here would also be subject to change. So instead, I would advise using an import tax calculator to get a rough idea of how much the charge will be. Depending on couriers, sometimes you are able to see and pay these fees as part of delivery, but sometimes the couriers will turn up asking for payment of taxes, and if you've not budgeted for that beforehand and purchased something expensive, that can cause serious issues. So it's best to put in the legwork in advance so you don't get any nasty surprises. Now, while the focus here is JDM watches, if you're shopping on Chrono24 or eBay, it's very common to see that no matter what you're shopping for watch-wise, the most affordable pieces are often listed from Japan. However, these prices often do not include import tax, so I would be wary about buying non-JDM models from Japan simply because you've got to calculate that extra tax cost in order to compare pieces like for like. Not only that, but unless you're living out in the Far East, returns are more awkward and potentially more costly. Now, all of that is true for JDM pieces as well. The difference there is that importing is likely to be your only option in that regard, as your only other alternative is to try and find pieces where somebody has already paid to import them into your domestic region, which would be far rarer. Having said all that, I have bought non-JDM pieces from Japan, including the Casio G-Shock model you're seeing in some of these shots. The reason for that is Japan is fairly fanatical compared to the West when it comes to watch shops. There are just so many of them out there. There's so much competition that sometimes, regardless of that import tax and shipping, you can still pick up an absolute bargain. In other words, there's no hard and fast right or wrong answer about importing non-JDM pieces, but shopping carefully would be my general advice. Now, if you are shopping at the most expensive end of the market, the import tax charge may be so high that it's actually better to fly to Japan yourself to make the purchase. In that regard, it's worth saying that Japan is my favourite country other than my own, but is set to change its approach to tourism over the next year or so, with talk of two-tier pricing and a range of other measures to try and cut down on nuisance tourism that the country has been struggling with. However, if you do want to buy a watch while you're in the country, you need to be acutely aware of the rules when it comes to bringing it back to your own. If you're wearing the watch, it's physically on your wrist. Most countries will consider it to be a personal effect, akin to your mobile phone, and you won't pay import tax on it. If you're bringing an expensive watch back, transporting it in box, carrying a receipt for it, then it's likely to need declaring at customs, and fees are highly likely to be charged. It's therefore important to make sure that if you're going to do it, you look at the rules for bringing watches back into your own country first. To get around this, there are some companies out there who act as middlemen in the process, where they will handle getting the watches to you. One example of this would be Sakura Watches, a website which lists a huge number of JDM models, which can be a really helpful feature as it's an easy way of seeing what models are actually out there. Of course, as middlemen, they look to take a cut. They wouldn't exist without it. So just like buying from any company, I would always look at prices elsewhere to make sure you're paying a fair market rate. I'll just wrap up with some recommendations for JDM pieces to look into. In all honesty, that could be its own separate video, so I'll try to be brief here so as not to rob myself of that fun later on down the line. Now, in the background footage of this piece, you'll have seen some of the JDM models that I own. Those either have, or are soon to have, their own dedicated videos on my channel though, so I'm going to mention a few other pieces instead that I think are worth your time. Some of this footage has been of a model from the Oceanus range, which was until recently for the domestic market only, but does now have some international models. Having said that, the JDM pieces are considerably better value, and I would be looking at something like the Casio Oceanus Manta OCW S400 2AJF. It's a gorgeous 41.3mm in diameter, 9.2mm thick titanium piece with one of the best bezels I've seen and a wave motif dial to help accentuate the Manta theming. Another suggestion would be looking at the Campanola models from Citizen. This is effectively a luxury sub-brand that is only available in Japan and contains a number of unique and interesting pieces. Seiko have something similar with the Brights range, a mid-tier luxury offering of watches that are only available for the domestic market. It is worth saying that with both these ranges, where watches prove particularly popular, you do sometimes get similar looking Western releases, so it's definitely worth doing your homework if there's something that really catches your eye. As a final aside, I'd love to hear your thoughts on watches made for the Japanese domestic market. Are there any oversights that I've forgotten to mention in the video that you'd want to share as consumer advice? Have you had any experiences you'd like to share, either positive or negative, with others? And are there any other JDM models that you would want to recommend? Let's discuss in the comments section below. As ever, thank you for your time. If you've enjoyed what you've seen or found it informative, consider dropping the video a like and subscribing for more content like this in future.